Thank you, Will. Thank you, PIGSquad. I'm Casey Cameron, and I know a lot of you here are, you do everything yourself, from coding to art to music and sound, so I hope I can show you some audio fundamentals today that you can employ to ensure you get great quality audio without any hiccups. I started off in the game industry doing non-audio work for 2K games, and I worked on those games, and through 2K games, I was able to meet the folks at 2K Sports, which then finally launched my audio career, and I've been working on those games. That's a decade of work. So we're going to talk mostly about post stuff. You've already created your sound in your DAW, and you're ready to export it. So you want to make sure that you don't export something that's encoded, because we're going to do a lot of editing to the files after the fact. So when you export as MP3, that's a lossy codec, which means that the quality is going to degrade from the original. And if you edit that and save it further, the quality will get less and less each time you do that. So export WAV files at 1644, which is 16-bit, and 44,100 samples. We want our game engine to encode waves anyways. All right, so the other thing to know that's very important is most of your sound effects are going to be mono. You want them to be mono because it saves a lot of space, probably half of the actual disk space that an audio file would take. And if you're putting this stuff into a 3D game engine, your 3D game engine is going to do the spatialization for you. You don't need stereo information. You don't need stereo information for any single point in space. Let your engine do it for you, and you probably don't need stereo sound effects in platformers either, and especially not for VO. We've only got one mouth, so just use mono files for VO. I would use stereo files for music. That's important information. The musical information is important, the left and right channel, and sometimes for ambient sound effects, if it's like a global setting, like maybe a huge blizzard has just hit, and you want that to be heard separate from the player's audio listener. Let's skip this because I don't have a lot of time, but in short, name your stuff smartly. I use prefixes like SFX, AMB for ambient, MUS for music, VO for VO. Okay, so we've exported it, we've converted it to mono, and we're ready to start cleaning up. You're going to use a single track editor like Audacity to clean up your assets. I use Wavelab, so the screenshots in this presentation will be from Wavelab. And Audacity is free, it's great, it's probably all you need. So some of the things we're going to do, we're going to fix clipping issues, we're going to do a lot of topping and tailing, which involves removing silence, removing glitches, and making sure it starts and stops at the zero crossing. So you can see here, I've highlighted on the left, this is about a handful of milliseconds of silence. Delete silence because it takes up space. It takes up disk space. It may cause timing issues on playback with your animations, so I would remove that highlighted spot on the left image. And over on the right image, I'm pointing out some extraneous information. I know that this is a musical sound effects for like a power-up, and that power-up should hit big right at the get-go. And what I've got there is probably like some sort of crescendo cymbal roll that's not necessary. So I would remove that too. A little bit of silence at the top is okay. So this is about 2 milliseconds of silence. A handful of seconds, of milliseconds rather, is just fine. But at the end, I always get a lot of silence at the end when I bounce out my audio. And trimming this, it's about a second worth, a little bit more. That saved me 84 kilobytes, so that will add up if you have a lot of sound. Make sure you check for glitches. Sometimes when you export, you can actually catch a bit of your neighbor if you're not careful, rather the neighboring sounds or music. Or sometimes your plugins can give you grief and give you some artifacts in the files, and that happens to me pretty much every time. One in the batch. And something very important for you to understand is what the zero crossing is. The zero crossing is this yellow line that I've highlighted, and you'd see the equivalent in Audacity. And what this is, it's basically zero input. It's like the safe spot. And you notice at the left of this, the start of the sound file, it's starting at 0, which means we're going to have no problem on playback. However, this point, you can see a sample here, a sample being like what frames are for film, 24 frames in film. 44,100 samples per second of audio. This sample starts above the zero crossing, and your digital playback engine is going to potentially have problem with the playback. You might get a click or a pop, and that's really bad news. You always want to make sure to check your file and mitigate this problem, or get rid of it rather. So this is the same sound file. The rule of thumb is basically take 2 milliseconds of your sound file and fade it in. And now you can see over here on the left, it starts at 0, and now we have a healthy sound file. Fade out's pretty self-explanatory, but I'd like to encourage you to take longer fade outs. I've taken a good chunk of the tail of this music here. There's a big section of audio engine energy there, and I like to start my fade outs from pretty much the last thing that happens in the music. I normally, I feel personally that it's a more natural fade, and I sort of do the same with sound effects too. You can play around with this, but I've just noticed that when I fade out just a tiny section of the tail, the reverb tail gets, it sounds unnatural. This is a really bad problem. This is clipping. So essentially, you can see in the middle where you had these peaks and valleys, it's kind of hit its limit, which is the 0 decibel limit, and it's cut off at the top. It's also cut off at the bottom down on the right. This is really bad news. It's going to sound like distortion. It's going to sound like you're playing a game online with your friends and your friend is screaming into the mic. The best way to go about fixing this is you go to the source, you go back into your DAW and you fix it there, or you re-record it. If you can't do that, then you get a program like Wavelab to do its whatever magic it does to it. But even though I have the capability to do that, I always bring up my old DAW and I fix it. I adjust the levels or I re-record it. It's best practice. Let's talk about how to make loops. Making loops can be difficult and challenging, but here's a technique that should help you guys out. This is an ambient sound effect. It is a natural forest that I recorded in Norway. It was probably about 2 minutes long, and I recommend you guys use long ambient files. That's always best practice, at least a minute. But for our purposes, I've combed this down to about 20 seconds, and I shrunk it down on both sides and found a start and end point that sounds kind of similar so that I can mash it up later. But that's not actually where we're going to do the loop point. You're going to go inside of the audio region, and you're going to pick a point of relatively low audio energy, and we're going to splice it there. And these are going to be our new loop top and tail points. So as you see, I've spliced the audio file. My beginning portion is now the part on the right, and my end portion is now the part on the left. I know this loop point is going to work because it was a contiguous part of the sound that I recorded. That's what actually happened in nature, and now I've just split it. So I can swap the positions, and I know that this start point, or that end point, when you get to the end point and loop back around, it's going to sound natural. Now the portion in the middle was our old beginning and end, and as I said, you found something pretty similar that you can overlap here, the two audio files, and crossfade them, and they'll mash it together. A crossfade is essentially you're fading out one while you're fading in the other. So it should work out pretty well, and that's what this slide is about, crossfade. After you're done, you have to export it, and it's your magical 2 millisecond rule, top and tail at 2 milliseconds, because every loop that you export, unless you get lucky, is going to start above the 0 crossing. So here's our 2 millisecond fade in and 2 millisecond fade out. And make sure you check for a seamless loop in the cycle mode. Music loops are easier because you know exactly where you're going to make the loop point. But however, they're more challenging in that you need to bake in the reverb tail that would naturally occur in music. Normally, if you think you go to and you see a choir concert in a great hall, and they're singing and they stop, their voices continue to reflect across the surfaces in the room, much like my voice is doing right now in this room. And it would feel unnatural if I was speaking in a vacuum and when I stopped, there was no reverb tail. You need to bake the equivalent into your music. So, let me go back. I'm lucky because I use Logic a lot, and Logic says, hey, I'm going to do this for you automatically. And I say, great, thank you, Logic. But a lot of DAWs don't let you do that. The DAW that I'm trying to transition to, called Cubase, I don't think lets me do that. So I'm going to have to start doing it manually, and this is how I'll do it. I'm going to export the music with its tail intact. and I'll bring it back into my DAW, or you can bounce the audio in place if your DAW does that functionality. I'm going to cut off that tail, and I'm going to go and bring it over to the top. And when I bounce this out, it should mesh together pretty nicely. This can get fussy, so you're just going to have to test it out, mess around with it. But again, once you export this, bounce it out and top and tail it, 2 millisecond fade in, fade out. Oh, I went too far. Also, I'd like to shout out to Toby. Everything needs a sound effect. That was good. All right, audio file formats. Like I said before, don't export your file formats in an encoded format. Don't edit them in MP3s or anything else. Edit them as waves. And we want to edit these waves and finalize them and let our game engine encode it into the build. By default, Unity and Unreal should encode and package these sound as OGG Vorbis. If you must encode them yourself, use OGG Vorbis for Windows and Android, and use AAC, or AKA M4A, for iOS. And OGG and M4A should loop seamlessly and are fantastic quality out of the gate. They're better quality than MP3s. And here's the one thing that I would really love you all to take away with. MP3 is not the villain, but you should all be aware that when you bounce out a file as an MP3, there's going to be a section of silence at the top. You can see here there's about roughly 45, 50 milliseconds of nothing. This is baked into my final version of the sound. And what this basically is it essentially represents the space they use to store the metadata. So that's bad news. If this is a loop, it's not going to loop on itself. There's going to be a blip. There's going to be a gap. And I've heard indie games on Steam with this problem, and it's something you should avoid. And I apologize if you weren't aware of this, because you were living in blissful ignorance. You might notice from now on. So this is a very important thing to avoid. So thank you very much for watching, and feel free to get in contact with me if you've got questions and stuff like that. Thank you. Does anybody have any questions? Yes?
Do you have any advice for adjusting the levels of all the sound effects in a game relative to each other?
Do I have any advice for adjusting all of the sounds in the game relative to each other? So like, I would recommend, if you have a tool in your game engine such as an audio mixer, please use an audio mixer. The first thing that you should be doing is when you create these sounds, I normally create these sounds in my DAW at about -12 decibels, and I balance them that way first. I'll export them then and put them in the game engine. And I would individually change the file if it's a little bit too hot, but send it through an audio mixer. I send it to a specific channel devoted to sound effects that I can monitor. I would send the music through to a specific channel devoted to music that I could monitor, or ambient channel, and I would balance them that way. And you have a greater control over each of those categories by using an audio mixer. And if you see you're having problems, then you can go in and add things to the channel that might mitigate it, or go back and find the offending sound and lower its volume. All good? Great. Thanks very much, guys. Thank you, PIGSquad.